Picture this: a quiet evening at a local diner, where a family of four walks in, eager to enjoy a meal together. What should have been an ordinary night quickly spirals into something far more troubling. A waitress, who is supposed to be offering service with a smile, instead casts a suspicious glance in their direction. But this isn't just a cold stare. No, this is a kind of judgment that leads to an unimaginable decision: calling the police. As the tension rises and you feel the weight of the moment, the question lingers: why would she do this? What was it that set off this chain of events? And most importantly, what happens next? If you think you can predict how this will unfold, think again, because what you're about to witness will shock you in ways you never saw coming. Now, I know you're probably asking yourself, what could possibly make a situation like this escalate so quickly? I promise you, the answer will keep you glued to your screen. In this video, we're diving deep into a story that uncovers not only the shocking decision of this waitress, but the aftermath that will leave you speechless. Trust me, you won't want to miss the twist that completely changes everything. As we move through this story, think about how many times you've walked into a restaurant, sat down, and been treated with respect and kindness, something we all take for granted. But what happens when that basic human decency is stripped away? What happens when one person's actions put the safety and dignity of an entire family at risk? This isn't just another viral video you'll scroll past. No, this is a story about something much deeper, about racism, assumptions, and the consequences of prejudices that, unfortunately, still haunt our society today. Now, don't just watch passively. I want you to really think about this. When you hear that the police were called on a family simply trying to enjoy a meal together, what emotions come up for you? Anger? Confusion? Perhaps disbelief? Whatever it is, you're not alone. This is an experience that is far too familiar for many people, and yet the shocking truth that comes to light in this story will leave you questioning everything. As we dig deeper, we'll meet the key players in this situation. There's the waitress, who has made a choice that will forever be remembered. Then there's the family. Their experience will resonate with anyone who has ever been judged based on nothing more than the color of their skin. And of course, we can't forget the police, who are called to the scene in a way that no one expected. What unfolds between them and the family isn't just an exchange of words. It's a collision of ideas, actions, and beliefs that will have lasting consequences. But here's the thing. This story doesn't just end with a call to the police. No, that's just the beginning. What happens next is something you won't see coming. And I'm not going to spoil it for you just yet. All I'll say is that the fallout from this event is far-reaching and affects everyone involved in ways that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about human interactions, empathy, and justice. So, here's what I need you to do. Stick with me. Watch until the very end. Because as we peel back the layers of this story, I promise you, the truth will emerge in a way that will leave you absolutely speechless. This is a tale of racism, a fight for dignity, and a stark reminder that the way we treat each other matters. And I know you're going to want to see how it all unfolds. But before we dive deeper into the heart of the matter, take a moment and reflect on your own experiences. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you were unfairly judged or treated differently because of something you had no control over? Maybe you witnessed it happening to someone else. Whatever the case may be, I want you to keep that in mind as we move forward, because this isn't just about one family. This is about all of us. It's about how we see each other and how we can do better. And just when you think you have it figured out, just when you think the story is going to take a predictable turn, something happens that flips everything on its head. You won't believe what happens next, and it will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Stick with me, because what you're about to see is the kind of story that will stay with you long after the video ends. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. How could something like this happen in 2025? Isn't this the kind of thing we've moved past? But as you'll see, the reality is far from simple. The incident you're about to witness is a reflection of so much more than just one waitress's bad judgment call. It's a mirror to a larger issue, one that we cannot ignore if we hope to move forward as a society. So here's the deal. Grab your seat, stay locked in, and prepare to be shocked. You're going to get the answers to the questions that brought you here. Why did the waitress call the police? What was the response from the officers? And most importantly, what happens when the family confronts the truth of what they've experienced? The twists and turns ahead will leave you questioning not just what happened, but what could happen in the future if we don't take a hard look at these issues. Get ready, because we're just getting started. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The incident at the diner didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was part of a much larger story, one with layers of history and context that went far beyond the simple act of a waitress making a phone call. As the family sat at their table, tension had already begun to simmer in the air, a subtle undercurrent that few people around them were aware of. It wasn't just the food that brought them to this diner. It was a night meant to ease a burden of their everyday struggles. They had been through so much over the years: work stress, family challenges, and even racial prejudice. But tonight was supposed to be different. The father, a man of dignity and quiet strength, looked across the table at his children, his mind momentarily distracted by the sound of silverware clinking against plates, the murmur of other diners. He thought about the moments in life when things just seemed to fall into place, when joy seemed to be the only thing that mattered. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. The waitress, on the other hand, had seen this family walk in and instantly felt a sense of unease. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the way they carried themselves, the way they walked into the diner, as though they were used to facing challenges, as though they didn't expect to be treated as equals. Or maybe it was the dark glasses the father wore, hiding his eyes, giving off a cold vibe that made her feel uncomfortable. Whatever the reason, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. There was something in the air, something unspoken. She'd been working at the diner for years, and in all that time, she had learned to trust her instincts. The longer she watched the family, the more suspicious she became. It wasn't just the way they acted. It was something deeper. It was the way they interacted with each other, the way they seemed to be carrying a weight that was invisible to most but so apparent to her. And despite her best efforts to keep her feelings to herself, she couldn't stop the thought from creeping in. Maybe they were just trouble. Maybe they were hiding something. But she wasn't about to make any rash decisions. Not yet. She went about her job, keeping her head down, delivering the family's food, and tried to ignore the gnawing feeling of discomfort in her gut. But as the night wore on, things began to escalate. The family, for their part, tried their best to ignore the undercurrent of tension that seemed to follow them through the diner. They laughed and joked among themselves, talking about the kids' schoolwork, their plans for the weekend, and the small victories they'd achieved. But the father's mind kept returning to the waitress. Something about her felt off. He could see it in the way she glanced at them, her eyes narrowing every time she passed by their table, her shoulders tense. He couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The mother, too, felt the unease, but she brushed it off. She didn't want to make a scene, not in front of the children. She'd seen it before, the subtle looks, the sideways glances. She'd grown used to it, but tonight felt different. As the waitress walked by again, the mother caught her eye and gave her a polite nod. But instead of reciprocating the gesture, the waitress hurried away, her eyes darting nervously in the other direction. It wasn't long before the situation took a dramatic turn. The father stood up to go to the restroom, leaving the mother and children at the table. He had barely stepped inside when he noticed a group of officers standing near the front of the diner, talking to the waitress. His heart skipped a beat. Something wasn't right. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was the reason they were there. The officers seemed to be taking their time, listening to the waitress with an air of caution. They weren't rushing to act, but something in the way they were positioned, their hands hovering near their belts, their eyes scanning the diner, told him that they were preparing for something. As the father lingered by the restroom door, trying to piece together what was happening, he heard one of the officers speak into his radio. A moment later, the door opened, and the other officer stepped inside, locking eyes with him. "Can I help you, sir?" the officer asked, his tone flat but unmistakably stern. The father swallowed hard, the knot in his stomach tightening. He didn't know what had happened, but he could feel the shift in the air. Something had gone horribly wrong, and he was about to be caught in the middle of it. Back at the table, the mother tried to keep the children calm. The youngest one, a boy of about 7, was fidgeting nervously, sensing the change in the atmosphere. His older sister, a teenager, stared intently at her phone, her fingers tapping nervously on the screen. She had already picked up on the tension and was doing her best to remain composed. But even she couldn't ignore the way the waitress had looked at them, the way her eyes had lingered a little too long, like she was trying to make them feel unwelcome. The waitress, for her part, had moved to the counter, where she continued to talk to the officers. It was clear that she wasn't just reporting a minor issue. No, something more serious had happened. The officers were now scanning the diner, their eyes lingering on the family. The father could feel the weight of their gaze through the restroom door. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This wasn't the first time he had felt this kind of scrutiny, this kind of judgment, but this time felt different. This time, it wasn't just about him. It was about his family, the ones he was supposed to protect, the ones who depended on him to shield them from the ugliness of the world. And now, here he was, caught in a situation where he didn't even know how to protect them. The tension was palpable, thick in the air. The father stepped out of the restroom, his mind racing. He had to act fast. He couldn't let this escalate any further. But before he could make a move, the officer at the door turned to him. "We need to speak with you," the officer said, his voice cold and authoritative. The father's heart sank. He hadn't done anything wrong, but the implications of the situation were clear. Whatever the waitress had said, it was enough to make the police believe that something was happening in the diner that shouldn't have been. But what could it be? What had they done? The questions flooded his mind, but he knew there was no time for answers. He nodded silently and walked toward the officers, his mind still spinning with confusion. What had really happened in the last few minutes? What was the waitress's true motive? And why had the situation escalated so quickly? But there was one thing he knew for sure. The night was far from over. And the truth, when it finally came to light, would shake everyone to their core. As the father walked toward the officers, a sinking feeling in his stomach only grew heavier with every step. He glanced back at his family, his wife trying her best to keep her composure, her face pale but steadfast. His children, all too young to fully grasp the weight of what was happening, were watching with wide eyes. His heart hurt at the thought of them having to witness this, a moment that would stick with him forever. He had always promised them that he would protect them from this world, from the kind of hate and misunderstanding that had plagued so many families before them. But now, here he was, caught in a situation where he couldn't make the rules, couldn't control the outcome. The world seemed to be closing around him, and the one thing he had always relied on, his ability to stand tall and make the right call, was slipping away. The officers watched him closely as he approached. The tension in the air was thick, and the waitress, standing behind the counter, was still locked in a quiet conversation with another officer. He could hear the occasional murmur, the clinking of keys, but everything felt muffled, as if the noise had faded into the background. His entire focus was on the officers, their expressions unreadable. "Sir," one of the officers said, his tone firm but not hostile, "we need you to stay calm and cooperate. There seems to be some confusion here." His words didn't offer much comfort. The father's mind raced as he tried to piece together what could have caused this. Was it something his family had done? Did they behave in a way that had drawn attention? He couldn't remember anything unusual. "There's been a report," the officer continued, "that there's a disturbance happening here. We need to get to the bottom of it." The father nodded, though his thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion. "Disturbance?" he repeated, trying to keep his voice steady, but it cracked at the end. "There's no disturbance. We're just here to have dinner." The officer raised an eyebrow, and for a brief moment, the father felt like the man was sizing him up. "We have our reasons to believe otherwise, so we'll need to ask you and your family a few questions." At that moment, the waitress, who had been speaking to the officers in low tones, caught the father's eye. There was something about her expression, something cold and calculating, that made his blood run cold. She was staring at him with a look of indifference, and it felt like the first time she'd truly seen him, like she was sizing him up for the first time in a way that made his skin crawl. She was watching him like prey, and the thought sent a wave of discomfort through him. As the officers led him to a quiet corner of the diner, the tension was palpable. The family was still sitting at the table, their faces painted with confusion and worry. But he could see that his wife was trying to keep the kids calm, trying to shield them from the nightmare that was unfolding. But there was no hiding from the truth. Things had already spiraled too far. The officers began questioning him, asking basic questions at first. But the father could feel their probing, digging into things that felt out of place. They asked about his name, his family, where they were from, why they were at the diner, but each question felt more pointed than the last. It wasn't just routine. It felt like an interrogation. Something wasn't right, and that nagging feeling in his gut refused to go away. And then the twist came. The officer asked him about the father's background. The question felt strange, too personal, but he answered anyway. He wasn't sure why the officer was asking, but he figured it was just protocol. But then the officer asked something that made him freeze. Have you ever been involved in a public altercation before? Any disputes or complaints filed against you in the past? The father's mind reeled. The question didn't make sense. No, he hadn't been involved in any disputes. He had been a hard-working man, a father who cared for his family and stayed out of trouble. So why was the officer asking about something that was irrelevant to the situation? It felt like they were trying to find something wrong with him, to discredit him in any way they could. Before he could even respond, another officer, one who had been standing near the door, suddenly stepped forward with a document in hand. The father couldn't see the details of the paper, but he could tell it was important. The officer's face was grim, his eyes flicking between the document and the father. "Sir," the officer said, "we have a report here that suggests you might have been involved in a violent incident a few months ago. We need to clarify these details." The father's heart skipped a beat. A violent incident? He hadn't been involved in anything of the sort. What were they talking about? He felt a rush of panic flood his chest as the walls of the diner seemed to close in on him. The officer handed him the document, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The noise of the diner, the murmurs of conversation, the clinking of plates, all of it disappeared. The document was a report about an altercation, a fight that had taken place months ago. It wasn't even something he remembered clearly, but the way the officer was talking, the way he was acting like this was some kind of breakthrough, it felt like he was being pinned down for something that wasn't his fault. The report was wrong. The details were twisted, and yet, somehow, it was being used to justify why the officers were involved in his family's dinner tonight. But what hit him hardest was this. The report wasn't just about him. It had been filed by someone else. Someone who had claimed that they had been assaulted by a black man in a public space. The accusation was vague, but it was enough to put the father in the hot seat. He was now being accused of something he didn't do, and the officer wasn't letting him explain. They were only making things worse. "I don't know anything about this," the father said, his voice shaky but firm. "I've never been involved in any fight. This is a mistake." But the officers weren't listening. They seemed to have made up their minds. It was as if the accusation alone was enough for them to treat him like a suspect, as if the color of his skin was all the evidence they needed. The father's head swirled with confusion, frustration, and disbelief. How had something so trivial, so misunderstood, escalated to this level? Meanwhile, back at the table, the family was trying to make sense of everything. The mother was standing now, her face full of concern as she exchanged worried glances with the children. The youngest was fidgeting in his seat, clearly scared, while the older one, his teenage daughter, was tapping away at her phone, trying to make sense of what was going on, trying to piece together what they had missed. The waitress, still standing at the counter, had been watching the entire exchange with a cold, calculating gaze. She had made the call that had started all of this, the call that had brought the officers into their world. And now, as the father stood there, trapped in a web of lies and accusations, she was watching him carefully, as if waiting for him to crack under pressure. But what was her real motive? Why had she gone to such extremes? And why had the officers seemed so eager to involve themselves in something so trivial? The truth was becoming clearer with every passing moment. The situation was far from simple. There was something much deeper at play here, a mystery that had been lurking beneath the surface for far too long. The family was caught in the middle of something that wasn't just about a misunderstanding at a diner. It was about something far bigger, something that had yet to be uncovered. But with every passing second, they were getting closer to the truth. And when it finally came, it would shatter everything they thought they knew about the world they lived in. The father's mind was reeling as he stood frozen in the corner of the diner, the document in his hand, a stark reminder of how easily lives could be twisted by a false narrative. His heart pounded in his chest as the officer continued to probe, the words cutting deeper with every sentence. The officer's voice, which had once seemed professional and calm, now sounded mechanical, like the gears of a machine designed to move him through a system that didn't care to understand. The father was caught between two worlds, the one he knew, grounded in truth, and the one the officers were trying to impose on him, full of falsehoods, misconceptions, and fear. "You need to tell us what happened," the officer pressed, his gaze now shifting from the document to the father's eyes. There was no warmth in his expression, only suspicion, like he had already decided who was guilty and was simply waiting for confession to spill out. But the father knew that this wasn't about truth anymore. It was about control. The officers were no longer interested in facts. They were interested in following a script. "I've told you everything," the father said, his voice trembling but determined. "I don't know anything about this report. It's not me. It's not my family." The officer nodded slowly, as if digesting the words, but the unease in the father's chest remained. The situation was spiraling, and no one seemed to care to listen, to see beyond the surface. This was bigger than a simple case of mistaken identity. This wasn't just a family dining out. This was a power struggle, a test of resilience against an unjust system. The officer's next words made the father's stomach drop further. "We're going to need to take your family in for questioning," the officer stated flatly, as though it were the next logical step in a process that had already been set in motion. The father's hands clenched into fists, but he didn't know what to do. He felt helpless, trapped between his family's safety and the overwhelming force of situation that had escalated far beyond his control. But just as the officers moved toward the family, a voice interrupted the tension. It was soft at first, barely more than a whisper. "I think you should listen to the man," the voice said, steady and firm. The officers turned in unison, as if surprised by the interruption, but they didn't expect what happened next. The waitress, who had been standing behind the counter, watching from periphery, stepped forward. There was no hesitation in her movement, just a quiet authority, as if she had stepped into a role that she had been preparing for all along. She walked up to the officers, holding her hands up slightly in a gesture that was neither hostile nor submissive. She wasn't here to fight them, but she was about to change the course of this entire situation. "I made the call," she said simply, her gaze now locking with the officer who had been interrogating the father. "But I made a mistake. This man is not the one you're looking for." Her voice was steady, resolute. "I saw someone leave the diner earlier, someone who fits the description. But it wasn't him. It was another man." The father blinked in shock, unable to process the words. He wasn't sure if he was hearing her correctly. For a moment, the officer seemed taken aback, clearly caught off guard by the sudden shift. One officer glanced at the other, their expressions now a mix of confusion and suspicion. They hadn't been prepared for this. "You're sure about this?" one of them asked, his tone more cautious now, the sharpness replaced by uncertainty. The waitress nodded. "I saw him leave right before everything started. But I didn't know his name. It wasn't until I overheard the conversation here that I realized a mistake I'd made. This man," she said, gesturing toward the father, "has done nothing wrong." The officers exchanged glances, and the father could feel the room shift. There was a flicker of doubt in their eyes, realization that they had jumped to conclusions too quickly. And for the first time since the entire incident began, the tension in the air began to ease. The father let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, but there was still so much left unsaid, so much that needed to be fixed. The damage wasn't just done to him. It had been done to his family, to their evening, to their sense of safety and belonging. The officers, looking uncertain now, turned back to the waitress. "Who was the person you're talking about?" the officer asked. His voice still held an edge, but the tension had shifted. It wasn't the same authoritative presence he had earlier. "I don't know his name," the waitress replied, shaking her head. "But I remember what he looked like. He was wearing a black jacket, jeans, and had a distinctive tattoo on his left forearm, a snake." The officers looked at each other, exchanging another quiet conversation between themselves. The father could feel his heart pounding once more, a sense of disbelief rising within him. The situation was evolving, but what would come next? The officers, still trying to piece things together, finally nodded. One of them stepped back, a signal to the other officers to reassess the situation. It wasn't full resolution yet, but it was a moment of pause, a brief break from the intense spotlight that had been cast upon him. They turned their attention toward the waitress, who now stood there, unwavering. "We'll need to check the security footage," one officer said, his voice now calm and professional. "If you're right, this will be resolved soon." The father's mind was still racing. He wanted to ask the waitress why she'd come forward, what had made her decide to speak up now. But before he could say anything, she looked at him, and her eyes told him everything. She didn't owe him an explanation. She had seen the truth and had done what she believed was right. She had been the one to correct the course of an unjust situation. As the officers turned to leave, the father returned to his family. His wife was still tense, her hand clenched around her son's, but there was a flicker of relief in her eyes. The kids were still uncertain, but the father could see the shift. The fear had lessened, if only slightly. The officers hadn't made any more threats, and that alone felt like a small victory. The waitress didn't follow them. Instead, she stood silently at the counter, her eyes briefly meeting the father's once more. In that moment, the weight of what she had done sunk in. She had given him a chance to defend himself. But there was more to her decision than just the right thing to do. She had seen something in him, in his family, and had chosen to make a stand. The officers returned soon after, but now they were no longer a threat. They apologized, explaining that they had reviewed the footage and confirmed the waitress's account. The confusion had cleared, but the scars of the moment lingered. The father wasn't sure what had been lost in all of this, but he knew that something had been irrevocably shaken. The sense of trust, the belief that justice would always prevail, had cracked, but it wasn't fully broken. The story didn't end with the family's immediate relief. As the officers left and the family gathered their things, the father couldn't help but feel that this incident was just a glimpse of something much larger, something that would continue to unfold his life, in the world around him. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew that he had fought for what was right, for his family and for the truth. As they walked out of the diner, the father took a deep breath, the cool evening air washing over him. He knew the world would be complicated, that his family's journey was far from over. But in that moment, he had won something that mattered. His voice had been heard, and in the end, that was what had made all the difference. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of inner strength and resilience. Until next time, stay strong, stay brave, and never forget your worth.